I remember the rain, how it fell in sheets that evening, transforming the city into something liquid and unfamiliar. 3 months since I'd left the community, and I still felt like I was drowning in all this newness, the noise, the lights, the endless stream of faces that never seemed to notice mine. The English world, as father called it. I pulled my second-hand jacket tighter, feeling the dampness seep through the worn fabric. The bus shelter offered little protection, but I lingered anyway, watching headlights slide across wet pavement like searching eyes. I'd found work at a bookstore downtown. Simple tasks, unpacking shipments, arranging shelves, helping customers find what they were looking for when I could. My boss, Elaine, hadn't asked many questions when I applied with no resume, no references, just a quiet voice explaining I was new to the city. She'd looked at me for a long time, then nodded as if she understood something I hadn't said. "Everyone's running from something, kid," she'd told me, handing me the application form. "At least you've got honest eyes." The rain showed no signs of stopping, so I stepped out anyway, letting it soak my clothes, my hair. Sometimes being drenched felt like the only thing that made sense in this place. To be physically overwhelmed in a way that matched how I felt inside. I wandered past closed storefronts, neon signs blurring into watercolor streaks through my rain-splashed glasses. The city felt emptier than usual, the downpour having driven most people indoors. I liked it this way. It reminded me, strangely, of home, the vast silence of fields after everyone had gone in for supper. The cafe appeared through the gray haze, its windows glowing amber against the darkening evening. Wicker chairs had been stacked and tied down for the night, all except one. A man sat there, alone at a small outdoor table, seemingly indifferent to the torrent. His coffee cup stood untouched before him. He wasn't wearing a coat. His white button-down shirt clung to his shoulders, transparent and defeated. He stared at nothing. I slowed my pace, then stopped entirely, watching him from across the street. There was something about the stillness of him. Like he'd made a decision to simply stop existing, but hadn't quite figured out how to disappear. I recognized that feeling. During my last year in the community, I'd spent whole days standing in corners of the barn, hoping to fade into the shadows, to dissolve into the dust motes floating in shafts of sunlight. This man seemed to be attempting the same impossible vanishing, right there in public view. I don't know what made me cross the street. In the community, we were taught to help strangers, to be the good Samaritan. But I'd quickly learned that in the city, approaching unknown people was considered intrusive, even dangerous. Yet my feet carried me forward, splashing through puddles until I stood a few feet from his table. He didn't look up. Rain dripped from his dark hair onto his face, trailing like tears, though his eyes were dry and distant. "Excuse me," I said, my voice nearly lost in the drumming rain. "Are you all right?" The words felt foolish as soon as they left my mouth. Of course he wasn't all right. No one sits in a downpour by choice. He blinked slowly, as if rising from deep water, and finally turned toward me. His eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, so light they seemed almost colorless. When they focused on me, I felt something inside me grow still and quiet, like a startled deer freezing in a meadow. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Thank you." But he didn't look away, and neither did I. The rain continued between us, connecting us in its constant rhythm. I noticed his hands then, artist's hands, long-fingered and elegant, despite their slight tremor. One rested beside the cold coffee cup, the other lay palm up on his thigh, collecting rainwater like an empty offering. "You're soaked," I said, stating the obvious. A small, humorless smile touched his lips, then disappeared. "So are you," he replied. The observation surprised me, as if I'd forgotten my own drenched state while watching his. For a moment, we were just two people equally surrendered to the elements, equally out of place in the empty cafe patio. I should have nodded and continued on my way. Instead, I gestured to the chair across from him. "May I?" I asked. He looked genuinely confused, as if I'd spoken in another language. After a pause that stretched just beyond comfortable, he nodded once. I sat down, placing my backpack on the wet ground between my feet. The chair was already pooled with water. It soaked immediately through my jeans. Neither of us acknowledged this discomfort. "I'm Eli," I said, offering my name like a small gift. In the community, introductions were unnecessary. Everyone knew everyone, generations back. Here in the city, I'd learned to give my name readily, one small anchor of identity in a sea of anonymity. He looked at me for a long time before responding. "James," he finally said. Just that. No last name, no handshake, no "nice to meet you." His eyes dropped to his untouched coffee. I noticed a slight scar running through his left eyebrow, a small imperfection that somehow made his face more real to me. The silence expanded between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with unspoken questions. I was about to get something to eat, I lied. In truth, I'd been heading back to my rented room, to the stale bread and peanut butter that constituted most of my meals these days. "Would you like to join me?" The invitation surprised me as much as it clearly surprised him. His eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious, searching my face for hidden motives. "Why?" he asked simply. It was a fair question, one I didn't have a ready answer for. Why was I inviting this stranger to dinner? What was I seeing in his rain-soaked solitude that compelled me to reach out? I thought of the community then, of the way we took in travelers, offered meals without question. Perhaps some habits were too deeply ingrained to break. "Because it's raining," I said, which wasn't really an answer at all. "And because you look like you could use a hot meal." I hesitated, then added, "And maybe because I don't want to eat alone tonight." This last part was true, though I hadn't known it until the words left my mouth. The constant solitude of my new life pressed against me suddenly, a physical weight on my chest. He studied me with those pale eyes, and I had the unsettling feeling he was seeing layers of me I'd kept carefully hidden. My uncertainty, my loneliness, the dull ache of displacement that followed me everywhere. Finally, he nodded again, a gesture so slight I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching so intently. "All right," he said, "but I can pay for myself." There was a quiet dignity in the way he said it, though his clothes suggested he might not have the means. I nodded, respecting his pride. "There's a diner around the corner," I suggested, remembering the warm, affordable place I'd discovered during my first week in the city. "Nothing fancy, but the food is good." James stood, leaving his cold coffee untouched. Up close, I realized how tall he was, towering over my own modest height. Despite being drenched, he carried himself with a kind of contained grace that spoke of a different life than the one his current state suggested. We walked in silence, rain still falling steadily around us. I noticed he kept a careful distance between us, never allowing his arm to brush against mine, even as we navigated the narrow sidewalk. At the diner's entrance, he paused, looking through the steamy windows at the scattered customers inside, the elderly couple sharing pie, the solitary truck driver hunched over coffee, the waitress leaning against the counter scrolling through her phone. For a moment, I thought he might change his mind, retreat back into the rain and whatever darkness had held him at that cafe table. "It's warm inside," I said softly, not quite an encouragement, not quite a plea. His eyes met mine again, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then he reached past me and opened the door, the small bell above it announcing our arrival with inappropriate cheerfulness. Heat enveloped us immediately, along with the smell of coffee and grilled onions. The waitress looked up, assessed our dripping clothes with resigned tolerance, and gestured toward a booth in the corner. "Sit anywhere," she called. "I'll bring some towels." James let me lead the way, following a step behind, as if uncertain of his welcome in this ordinary place. The vinyl booth squeaked beneath us as we sat across from each other. Under the fluorescent lights, I could see him clearly for the first time. He was older than I'd initially thought, mid-30s perhaps, with faint lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His face had a sculpted quality, all clean angles and shadows, handsome in a severe, weathered way. Despite his bedraggled appearance, there was something refined about him, something that suggested education, culture. His hands, I noticed again, were beautiful, an artist's hands or a musician's. The waitress arrived with 2 worn dish towels, dropping them on the table without comment. I took one gratefully, removing my glasses to dry them first, then running the towel over my hair. The world briefly dissolved into soft edge shapes, vulnerable without my glasses. When I put them back on, I found James watching me, his own towel unused in his hands. "You should dry off," I said, gesturing to the towel. "You'll catch cold." It was something my mother used to say, one of those practical concerns that filled the spaces between more meaningful conversation. He looked at the towel as if unsure of its purpose, then slowly brought it to his face, patting his skin with mechanical movements. Water continued to drip from his hair onto his shoulders. The waitress returned with menus and water glasses. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded, and after a moment, James did too. She disappeared again, leaving us to contemplate the laminated menus. I watched as James studied his, eyes moving carefully over each item as if translating from a foreign language. "The breakfast special is good," I offered. "They serve it all day." He nodded, closing the menu without really making a choice. When the waitress returned with coffee, he ordered what I had suggested. I did the same, finding comfort in the small synchronicity. Steam rose between us as we doctored our coffees, mine with too much sugar, his black. The hot liquid loosened something in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. I wrapped my hands around the mug, savoring its warmth. Across from me, James did the same, his long fingers encircling the ceramic as if it were a lifeline. "So," I began, feeling I should say something fill the silence somehow. "Have you lived in the city long?" It was a standard question, the kind strangers ask each other every day, yet it landed between us with unexpected weight. James took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "No," he said. "Not long." He offered nothing more, no elaboration, no return question. Yet it didn't feel like rudeness, more like caution, or perhaps preservation, as if each word cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. "Me neither," I said, not waiting for him to ask. 3 months. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, a small community. I was careful not to say Amish. That word invited too many questions, too many stereotypes, too many of the same jokes I'd heard repeatedly since arriving. "It's different here," I added unnecessarily. James nodded, his eyes meeting mine with unexpected understanding. "Everything is different. Until suddenly it isn't," he said. The statement hung between us, cryptic yet somehow profound. Before I could ask what he meant, our food arrived. Plates heaped with eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns, the diner's solution to almost any problem. We ate in companionable silence. I watched as James approached his meal methodically, taking small, careful bites as if relearning the act of eating. Halfway through, color began to return to his face, and his movements became more fluid, less mechanical. The tremor in his hands subsided somewhat. I wondered how long it had been since he'd eaten properly. "Thank you," he said suddenly, setting down his fork. "For this is." The gratitude seemed to encompass more than just the meal, though I couldn't say exactly what else he was thanking me for. Perhaps for seeing him when he was trying so hard to be invisible. Perhaps just for sitting across from him in ordinary human communion. "You're welcome," I replied, feeling strangely shy. "I'm glad you came." And I realized. Despite the strangeness of our meeting, despite his reticence, I felt more at ease with this silent man than I had with anyone since leaving home. There was no need to explain myself, to pretend understanding of cultural references that went over my head, to hide my otherness. We were both adrift, in different ways. "Where are you staying?" I asked, as we finished our meals. It was a practical question, yet as soon as I spoke it, I recognized the intrusion. James stiffened slightly, his guard visibly rising again. "I have a place," he said vaguely. His eyes dropped to his empty plate. I didn't press further, though I suspected a place might be a generous description. His clothes, while of good quality, had the worn look of items worn too many days in succession. His hair, now drying in uneven waves, needed a cut. Whatever circumstances had brought him to that rain-soaked cafe table, they hadn't been kind. The waitress brought our checks, placing them face down beside our plates. As promised, James paid for his own meal, carefully counting out exact change from a worn leather wallet. The deliberateness of his movements told its own story, someone measuring their resources down to the penny. I left cash for mine, plus a tip that was probably more generous than my budget allowed. Outside, the rain had stopped, though the street still glistened under the streetlights. The air felt cleaner somehow, the city washed new. We stood awkwardly at the diner entrance, the natural conclusion of our impromptu dinner having arrived. I should have said goodnight, turned toward my rented room, let this strange encounter end as randomly as it had begun. Instead, I found myself reluctant to leave, to release whatever tenuous connection had formed between us. "Which way are you headed?" I asked, hoping our paths might align for a few blocks more. James looked up at the night sky, visible in patches between buildings and clouds. "I'm not sure," he admitted, and the honesty in that simple statement struck me deeply. Not "I'm headed east" or "my place is downtown," just the truth of his uncertainty, his lack of destination. Without thinking, I made another unexpected offer. "I have a couch," I said, the words tumbling out before I could reconsider. "It's not much, but it's dry. If you need somewhere tonight?" I felt my face flush, suddenly aware of how the invitation might sound to someone else, a young man offering shelter to an older stranger. But it wasn't like that, or at least I didn't think it was. James looked at me for a long time, those pale eyes searching mine again, looking for intentions I wasn't sure I fully understood myself. "Why would you do that?" he asked, echoing his question from earlier. "You don't know me." There was no accusation in his voice, just genuine puzzlement. I thought about the community then, about the strict rules that had both sheltered and confined me, about the teachings of charity and suspicion that existed side by side, about the way we were taught to help travelers but fear outsiders. "Where I come from," I said carefully, "we believe in helping people who need it, and everyone needs something sometimes." It was a simplification of complex beliefs, but it was the truest answer I could give. He was quiet so long I thought he might not respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, without the rough edges. "I haven't slept in a real bed for 11 days, he said, the precision of the number revealing more than a general statement of homelessness might have. "But I don't want to impose on you." "It's just a couch," I said, though we both knew it was more than that. It was trust extended between strangers. It was an acknowledgement of human dignity. It was a hand reaching into darkness, hoping to be grasped. And I wouldn't offer if I didn't mean it. The walk to my apartment took 20 minutes, through streets I'd come to know but still didn't quite feel mine. James walked beside me now, our paces matching naturally. Occasionally, our shoulders would almost touch, and I'd feel a strange awareness move through me, like a current. We didn't speak much, but the silence had transformed from the awkward pause of strangers to something more comfortable, the quiet of shared purpose. My apartment was on the third floor of a converted house, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked under our weight. I fumbled with my keys at the door, suddenly self-conscious about the modest space I was about to reveal. "It's small," I warned, pushing the door open, "and not very furnished." The single room contained my few possessions: a bed pushed against one wall, a lumpy couch opposite, a small table with one chair, a hot plate balanced precariously on a milk crate. No television, no decorations, nothing to reveal personality or history. I'd been living there for months but had made no mark upon the space. James stepped inside after me, his eyes taking in the sparse surroundings without judgment. "It's perfect," he said quietly, and I heard in his voice a genuine appreciation that made my throat tighten unexpectedly. I busied myself finding towels, a spare t-shirt and sweatpants that might fit his taller frame, avoiding his eyes as emotion threatened to overcome me. Why was I so affected by this stranger's presence? Why did his simple gratitude make me feel both more and less than I had been before? "Bathrooms down the hall," I explained, handing him the small bundle of items. "Shared with the other tenants, but most of them are asleep by now." He nodded, taking the offerings with careful hands. "Thank you, Eli," he said, my name in his mouth sounding different somehow, invested with meaning beyond its single syllable. "I'll be quick." He disappeared into the hallway, leaving me alone in my room, suddenly aware of its emptiness, its lack of the comforts most people took for granted. I made up the couch with my spare sheets and the extra pillow from my bed. It wasn't much, but it was clean and dry. I put water on for tea, a habit I'd brought with me from home, one small tradition I maintained in this new life. By the time James returned, I had 2 mugs ready, steam rising from them in the cool room. He looked different in my clothes, softer somehow, less guarded. His hair was damp from washing, curling slightly at his temples. Without the rain and despair clinging to him, I could see more clearly the man he must have been before whatever circumstances had reduced him to sitting alone in the downpour. Educated, composed, handsome in an unconventional way that made it hard for me to look away. "Tea," I said unnecessarily, gesturing to the mugs on the table. "If you want some." He nodded, joining me at the small table that barely accommodated two people sitting knee to knee. The proximity was both uncomfortable and not. Strange to be so close to someone who was still essentially a stranger, yet somehow right, as if the smallness of the space matched the tentative connection forming between us. "Your home reminds me of a place I lived once," James said, wrapping his hands around the mug as he had done at the diner. "When I was about your age, just out of college. One room, hardly any furniture. I thought it was temporary." His smile was fleeting, tinged with something between nostalgia and regret. The simplicity has its own kind of peace. It was the most he'd said at once, and I found myself hungry for more. More words, more glimpses into who he was, who he had been. "Did you go to college here?" I asked, hoping to keep him talking. "No, back east, Rhode Island." He took a sip of tea, his eyes growing distant. "Another lifetime ago." The way he said it suggested a definitive break, as if his life had been cleaved into before and after by some significant event. I wanted to ask what had happened, what had brought him to that rain-soaked cafe table, but sensed it was too soon, that pressing would only cause him to retreat back into silence. "I never went to college," I offered instead, sharing something of myself. "Where I'm from, we usually finish school at 8th grade. I learned more from books on my own than in the classroom." I hadn't told anyone this before, about the flashlight under blankets, the library books hidden in the barn, my secret hunger for knowledge the community deemed unnecessary or dangerous. "Self-education," James nodded, a new respect in his gaze. "Often the most valuable kind. What did you read?" "Everything I could find," I admitted, feeling a flush of pleasure at his interest. "Science, history, novels, poetry, when I could get it." I didn't mention how the words had been lifelines, how they had shown me worlds beyond the boundaries of the farm, how they had ultimately given me the courage to leave during my rumspringa, knowing I would likely never be welcomed back. "A mind seeking nourishment will find it," James said softly, "even in unlikely places." There was understanding in his voice that went beyond mere words, as if he recognized in me something familiar, some parallel struggle despite our different backgrounds. We talked more as we finished our tea, small exchanges that carefully skirted the deeper waters of our respective pasts. I learned he had studied art history, that he could name all the bones in the human hand, that he preferred autumn to all other seasons. Simple facts that didn't explain how he'd ended up alone in the rain, but began to sketch the outlines of the man sitting across from me. In turn, I told him about my job at the bookstore, about the city parks where I spent my days off, about my fascination with subway maps and the ordered chaos of urban planning. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with us both. I showed him the couch, apologizing for its lack of comfort. "It's more than I've had recently," he assured me. And again I wondered where he'd been sleeping these past 11 days, what circumstances had brought him so low. I retreated to my own bed, separated from the couch by just a few feet of floor space. The intimacy of sharing such a small room with a stranger should have felt awkward, even threatening, yet somehow it didn't. Instead, I found comfort in the sound of another person's breathing, in the knowledge that for tonight at least, neither of us was alone. "Good night, James," I said softly, switching off the lamp. "Good night, Eli," he replied, his voice already thick with approaching sleep. "Thank you for seeing me today." There was a pause, and then he added, words barely audible in the darkness, "You're the first person who's seen me in a long time." I lay awake long after his breathing had deepened into sleep, turning his words over in my mind. "You're the first person who's seen me in a long time." What did it mean to be seen? In the community, I had been visible but never truly seen. My differences noted but not acknowledged. My questions silenced. My longings dismissed as youthful rebellion. In the city, I was invisible in another way. Just another face in the crowd, anonymous, unremarkable. Both kinds of unseen had their own particular loneliness. In the dim light filtering through the thin curtains, I could make out James's silhouette on the couch, the rise and fall of his chest, one arm flung above his head in the vulnerability of sleep. What had he meant by seeing him? Was it simply that I'd noticed him in the rain when others had passed by? Or was it something more? Some recognition that had passed between us, some unspoken understanding. I thought of his pale eyes holding mine, of the careful way he ate his food, of the precise manner in which he'd counted out his change. I thought of the scar through his eyebrow, the tremor in his hands, the way he'd said another lifetime ago with such finality. I found myself wanting to know everything. What had brought him joy in that other lifetime? What had wounded him? What dreams he'd abandoned? What he saw when he looked at me with those searching eyes? The realization hit me with unexpected force, stealing my breath. This wasn't just sympathy I was feeling. It wasn't just the charitable impulse I'd been raised with, the duty to help strangers in need. It was something else entirely. Something I'd had no words for in the community, something I'd barely allowed myself to acknowledge even in the freedom of my new life. It was a pull toward him that went beyond compassion, beyond curiosity, beyond any framework I had for understanding human connection. In the darkness of my small room, with this stranger sleeping just feet away, I finally named the feeling unfurling in my chest: desire. Not just physical, though there was that too. An awareness of his body that made my own respond in ways both frightening and exhilarating. But it was more than that. A longing to know him, to be known by him, to build something between us that had substance and meaning. The community had names for such feelings between men. Harsh words, whispered with disgust, followed by prayers for deliverance from unnatural temptation. I had carried those words with me even as I'd left everything else behind, had used them as walls to contain the parts of myself I feared to examine too closely. But here, in this moment, they seemed to lose their power, overshadowed by the simple truth of what I felt. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke to gray dawn light and the soft sounds of movement. James was sitting on the edge of the couch, fully dressed in his own clothes, now dry though still rumpled. He hadn't noticed I was awake, and for a moment I watched him, hands clasped between his knees, head bowed slightly, like someone preparing himself for a difficult task. There was a stillness about him again, but different from the empty stillness of the cafe. This was the quiet of decision, of gathering strength. He sensed my gaze and looked up, our eyes meeting across the small space. Something passed between us, unspoken but palpable. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of the strange intimacy we'd shared, of the barrier that had been crossed when he'd slept under my roof, used my towel, worn my clothes. The morning light softened his features, making him look younger, less weathered by whatever storms had battered him. "I should go," he said quietly, though he made no move to stand. "I've imposed on you enough." "You haven't imposed," I replied, sitting up in bed, suddenly aware of my rumpled t-shirt, my hair standing in all directions. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. "You could stay for breakfast. I don't have much, but—" "Eli," he interrupted gently. His voice around my name sent a current through me again, stronger than before. "You've been kinder than I deserve, but I can't—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words, with some internal conflict I couldn't fully see. "There are things you don't know about me. Things that would make you regret letting me into your home." The statement hung between us, heavy with implication. My mind raced through possibilities. Was he a criminal? An addict? Someone running from the law or from personal demons too dark to name? I found, to my surprise, that I didn't care. Whatever he had done or been, whatever circumstances had brought him to that rain-soaked table, they didn't change what had passed between us. That moment of recognition, of seeing and being seen. "We all have things in our past," I said carefully. "Things we're not proud of, things we're running from." I thought of my family, of the letter I'd written explaining I wouldn't be returning, of the knowledge that I was now considered dead to them, shunned, cut off, erased from family prayers and conversations. It doesn't mean we don't deserve kindness in the present. James looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, wonder perhaps or disbelief, mingled with something that might have been fear. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "Someone I used to be before—" He stopped again, shook his head. "Someone better than I managed to remain." "Stay," I said, the word coming out more intensely than I'd intended. "Just for breakfast, please." I wasn't ready for him to leave, for this unexpected connection to end. The thought of returning to my solitary existence, work, books, empty room, repeat, suddenly seemed unbearable. He hesitated, the conflict visible on his face. Then slowly he nodded. "Breakfast," he agreed. "But then I should go. It's better that way." There was a finality in his tone that suggested he truly believed this. That his departure was some kind of protection, for himself or for me, I couldn't tell. I made coffee on the hot plate, toasted the last of my bread, found half a jar of jam in the small refrigerator. It wasn't much, but James accepted it gratefully, the same careful attention in his movements as he spread jam on toast, sipped his coffee, wiped crumbs from his fingers. We ate in companionable silence, the morning light strengthening around us, lending substance and reality to what had begun in rain and darkness. "Tell me something real about yourself," I said suddenly, as we finished our meager breakfast. "Something true." I needed something to hold on to after he left, some piece of him that was authentic, not just the mystery of our strange encounter. James considered this, his eyes on his empty cup. When he looked up, there was a new openness in his expression, as if he'd made a decision to offer at least this much of himself. "I was a professor once," he said. "Art history. I had an office with windows that faced east. I could see the sunrise from my desk." His voice softened with memory. "I love teaching. Seeing students discover beauty in unexpected places, learning to look beneath the surface of things." The way he spoke made it clear this was no small admission. It was a significant piece of himself, offered with trust I wasn't sure I'd earned. "What happened?" I asked, though I knew immediately it was too much too soon. The openness in his face receded slightly. "Life happened," he said simply. "Choices, consequences, the usual story." He stood, taking our empty cups to the sink, rinsing them with methodical care. "I should go, Eli. Thank you for everything." It was happening too quickly. His imminent departure, the sense of something important slipping away. I stood too, moved toward him without clear intention, just knowing I couldn't let him leave like this, return to whatever emptiness had held him before our paths crossed. "Will I see you again?" I asked, hating the naked hope in my voice but unable to disguise it. James turned from the sink, and suddenly we were standing closer than we had been before, close enough that I could see the different shades of blue in his eyes, could smell the faint scent of my soap on his skin. "I don't think that would be wise," he said quietly. But he didn't step back, didn't create distance between us. His eyes held mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "You should stay away from broken things, Eli. They can cut you without meaning to." "I don't think you're broken," I said, though the evidence suggested otherwise. "Just a little lost, like me." The admission cost me something, an acknowledgement of my own vulnerability, my own incompleteness. James's expression softened, his guard lowering for a moment to reveal something tender beneath the weathered exterior. "That's the difference between us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not lost, Eli. You're just finding your way. There's hope in that." His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently, so gently I might have imagined it, touched my cheek. Just for a moment, the briefest contact before falling away again. But it was enough to send electricity through my entire body. Enough to confirm what I'd realized in the darkness of the previous night, that whatever was happening between us transcended simple kindness or charity. "I have to go," he said again, though he made no move toward the door. His eyes remained on mine, searching, as if memorizing my face, as if trying to communicate something words couldn't contain. The moment stretched between us, charged with unspoken possibility. And then, he said the words that changed everything, that confirmed what I'd felt but hadn't dared name. That made me realize this wasn't just about offering shelter to a stranger, wasn't just about doing the right thing. Words that opened a door I hadn't known existed, leading to a future I couldn't begin to imagine. "I've spent years running from people," he whispered, eyes never leaving mine. "But since the moment you spoke to me in the rain, Eli, all I can think about is how much I want to run toward you instead." His words hung in the air between us, vibrating with a truth neither of us had expected. "Since the moment you spoke to me in the rain, Eli, all I can think about is how much I want to run toward you instead." I felt my breath catch, my heart stumbling over its rhythm. Time seemed to slow, the morning light suspended around us like amber. James's eyes remained on mine, vulnerable in a way that made him seem both stronger and more fragile than before. I didn't know what to say. The language for this moment hadn't been part of my upbringing, had never been spoken in the community where feelings remained unvoiced, especially feelings like these. "I shouldn't have said that," James whispered, after the silence had stretched too long. He took a step back, breaking the tenuous connection between us. "I'm sorry. I've made you uncomfortable." The shame in his voice cut through my stunned silence, pulled me back to the present moment. "No," I said, finding my voice at last. "No, you haven't." I reached for words that could bridge the gap opening between us. I just, I don't know how to what? How to respond to this revelation that echoed my own unspoken thoughts? How to navigate feelings I'd been taught were wrong, sinful, impossible? I took a deep breath. "I feel it too," I finally admitted, the words barely audible yet somehow filling the entire room. "Whatever this is, I feel it too." Something shifted in James's expression, disbelief giving way to cautious hope. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for me again. Instead, he held perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this fragile moment of honesty between us. "You don't even know me," he said softly, not a rejection but a warning, a chance for me to retreat to safer ground. "I want to," I replied simply. My hands were trembling, but my voice had found its strength. "I want to know you." The boldness of my own words surprised me. In the community, such directness would have been unseemly, improper. But here, in this small room awash with morning light, the truth felt like the only language worth speaking. James closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain or prayer. When he opened them, there was a clarity there that hadn't been present before, as if some internal struggle had been resolved. "Then I should stay," he said, each word careful and measured. "If you'll let me." It wasn't quite a question, not quite a statement. Somewhere in between, a tentative step into unmapped territory. "Yes," I said, relief washing through me. "Yes, please, stay." I gestured awkwardly around the small room, suddenly aware of its limitations. "It's not much, but it's everything," James interrupted gently. The intensity in his eyes softened to something warmer, almost like gratitude. "A day ago, I was sitting in the rain, waiting for—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, though its dark implication hung in the air. "And now I'm here, with you." The wonder in his voice made my chest ache with an emotion I couldn't name. We moved through that day carefully, circling each other in the small space, establishing a cautious rhythm. I called Elaine at the bookstore, told her I needed the day off, my first such request since starting work. James brewed more coffee while I made the call, his movements in my tiny kitchen area becoming more natural, less hesitant. When I hung up, he handed me a steaming mug, our fingers brushing in the exchange, a small touch that shouldn't have meant anything but somehow meant everything. "We should get you some groceries," he said, eyeing my nearly empty refrigerator, "if I'm staying." There was a question in it still, uncertainty hovering at the edges of his words. I nodded, grateful for this practical focus, this tangible way forward. We needed food, normal things, anchors in this unfamiliar sea we were navigating together. The market on the corner was crowded with morning shoppers, the fluorescent lights harsh after the gentle sunlight of my apartment. James moved through the aisles with purpose, selecting affordable but nutritious items, his knowledge clearly born of experience with careful budgeting. I followed behind him, watching his hands as they reached for bread, beans, rice, a few vegetables. There was something compelling about seeing him like this, engaged with the ordinary world, making choices, existing outside the rain-soaked despair where I'd first found him. "Do you like oatmeal?" he asked, turning to me with a canister in hand. Such a mundane question, yet it pierced me somehow. This first inquiry into my preferences, my tastes, the small details that made me a particular person to him rather than just a generic benefactor. I nodded, smiling without meaning to. He smiled back, a real smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face into something younger, lighter. It was the first time I'd seen him truly smile, I realized, and the sight of it made my stomach flip in a not unpleasant way. Back at the apartment, we unpacked the groceries together, our movements around each other becoming more fluid, less awkward. James insisted on paying for the food with money from his worn wallet, and I didn't argue, understanding his need to contribute, to maintain some dignity in this undefined relationship forming between us. As we worked, I found myself stealing glances at him. The way his hair fell across his forehead, the careful precision of his hands, the line of his jaw as he concentrated on organizing cans in my nearly empty cupboard. Each observation felt both ordinary and illicit, a quiet cataloging of details I wasn't sure I had permission to notice. Tell me about your community, James said later, as we sat at my small table eating lunch. Simple sandwiches that tasted better than they should have. If you want to, that is. The gentle way he phrased it, leaving space for my refusal, touched me. Most people I'd met in the city either avoided the topic altogether or pressed with invasive questions, fascinated by what they considered the exotic otherness of my upbringing. I started slowly, haltingly, sharing fragments of the world I'd left behind. The rhythm of days marked by work and prayer, the silence of early mornings in the barn, the communal meals where words were sparse but connection was constant. I found myself speaking of things I hadn't articulated before. Not just the restrictions that had ultimately driven me away, but the beauty too. The way the whole community would gather to raise a barn in a single day, everyone's role essential and valued. The comfort of traditions passed through generations, the quiet faith that permeated everything, even the air we breathed. James listened with complete attention, his pale eyes never leaving my face, asking occasional questions that revealed his genuine interest. Not about buggies or clothing or electricity, the superficial details outsiders usually fixated on, but about deeper things, how decisions were made, how conflicts were resolved, how love was expressed when words were considered prideful or excessive. "And what made you leave?" he asked finally, the question I'd been both expecting and dreading. I looked down at my hands, unsure how to distill such a complex decision into words. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. James seemed willing to wait, to give me the space to find my way to an answer. "I couldn't breathe there," I said at last, the simple truth of it surprising me. Not fully, like I was always holding part of myself back, keeping it hidden. I glanced up, found his eyes still on mine, understanding rather than judgment in their pale depths. There were books I wanted to read, questions I needed to ask, parts of myself I needed to explore. I faltered on this last word, its implications hovering unspoken between us. In the community, my difference had been sensed but never named. Whispers about why I showed no interest in the girls my age, concerned glances when I spent too long working alongside Samuel Fisher, whose smile had made my heart race in ways I didn't understand. "And your family?" James asked softly. The question reopened a wound I'd been trying to ignore since leaving. I swallowed hard, fighting a sudden tightness in my throat. "They think I'm dead," I said, the words stark in the quiet room. Not literally, but I tried to explain the concept of shunning, of being cut off completely, my name no longer spoken, my place at the table empty and unremarked upon. They're praying for my soul, but they can't acknowledge my existence. Not unless I return and confess my sins before the congregation. "And you won't," James said, not a question but a gentle observation. "I can't," I replied, meeting his gaze. "Not now that I know." I hesitated, uncertain how to express what I meant. "Not now that I know there's more? More to the world? More to me?" "I can't unknow it," James nodded, a shadow of recognition passing over his face. "Some thresholds only go one way," he said quietly. "Once crossed, there's no returning to who you were before." The way he said it made me wonder what thresholds he had crossed, what previous self he could never reclaim. "Your turn," I said, gathering my courage. "Tell me something about you, something real." I echoed the request I'd made earlier, hoping he might be more willing to answer now, in this space of mutual vulnerability we'd created. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the worn tabletop. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. "I was married once," he said, the revelation surprising me, though I tried not to show it. "To a woman named Claire. We met in graduate school. She was brilliant, studying biochemistry while I was in art history. Opposites in many ways, but we understood each other." His face softened with the memory, pain and fondness mingling in his expression. "What happened?" I asked, echoing my earlier question, hoping this time he might answer more fully. James took a deep breath, his eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of my apartment, beyond the present moment. "She died," he said simply. "Cancer, 4 years ago." The words were factual, stripped of emotion, yet I could feel the weight of grief behind them, still raw despite the passage of time. I thought I was prepared. We had 18 months from diagnosis to the end. all the stages of acceptance, all the farewells. But when it happened, he shook his head, unable or unwilling to describe that moment. I came undone. I wanted to reach for his hand, offer some physical comfort, but something held me back. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the sense that his grief required space, not touch. "I'm sorry," I said instead. The words inadequate but sincere. After, he continued, as if needing to complete this part of his story now that he'd begun, I couldn't go back to teaching. Couldn't face the classroom, the routine, the normalcy everyone expected me to slide back into. I took a leave of absence, temporary at first, then permanent. He looked up at me, his eyes clearer now, present again. That was the beginning of the unraveling, from professor to what you found in the rain. There was more to the story. Gaps I could sense, shadows where details should have been, but I didn't press. He had given me this much, this significant piece of himself. The rest could wait until he was ready. "Thank you," I said simply, "for telling me." He nodded, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "It's strange," he said, "how long it's been since I've spoken about her. About any of it, really." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of emotional fatigue. "I should stop. This is too much, too heavy for—" "No," I interrupted gently. "It's not too much. Not for me." I meant it. After years of silent emotions, of feelings buried beneath the weight of community expectations, there was something almost liberating about this raw honesty, this sharing of pain without pretense or minimization. James looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps? Or gratitude? Or something deeper still? The day passed in this way, quiet conversations interspersed with comfortable silences, each of us gradually revealing more pieces of ourselves, building a fragile bridge of understanding between our very different worlds. As evening approached, James insisted on cooking dinner, a simple meal of rice and beans, elevated by spices he'd selected at the market. I watched him work at my hot plate, the confident movements of his hands, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows. There was a domestic intimacy to the scene that made my chest ache with longing for something I'd never allowed myself to imagine. A shared life. Ordinary days made extraordinary by companionship, by care, by this unnameable feeling growing between us. "Where did you learn to cook?" I asked, setting the table as he stirred the pot one final time. James smiled, and that same transformation lighting his face, making me catch my breath. "My grandmother," he said, a fondness in his voice I hadn't heard before. "She believed no education was complete without knowing how to feed yourself properly. Summer breaks from school, she'd have me in the kitchen every day, learning everything from scratch bread to curries hot enough to make your eyes water." He served the food onto our plates with careful attention. After Claire died, cooking was one of the few things that still made sense. Following steps, creating something nourishing. A kind of meditation, I suppose. We ate by the warm light of my single lamp, the world outside fading into darkness. The food was delicious, but what I remember most about that meal was the way James looked in the soft light. The sharp angles of his face softened, his eyes reflecting the small flame, his hands gentle around his fork and spoon. Something was happening to me as I watched him. A quiet unfolding, a permission I was finally granting myself to feel what I'd always denied. After dinner, the question of sleeping arrangements hung unspoken between us. The couch was there, made up from the night before, but something had shifted between us since then. Boundaries crossed, truth spoken, intentions revealed, however tentatively. James cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I should take the couch again," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "If you're still comfortable with me staying." "Of course," I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "And yes, the couch is— that's good?" I felt suddenly awkward, unsure of the proper protocol for this unprecedented situation. In the community, such arrangements would have been unthinkable. Unmarried people never shared living spaces, and certainly not men with men. But here in the city, in my small room with this man who had confessed wanting to run toward me, what were the rules? What was I allowed to want? That night, lying in my bed just feet away from where James rested on the couch, I found sleep impossible. I could hear his breathing, not the deep rhythm of slumber, but the irregular pattern of someone equally awake, equally aware of the other's presence. The darkness around us seemed charged, alive with unspoken words, with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. I wanted to speak, to bridge the small distance between us, but courage failed me. What would I say? What did I want to happen? The questions circled in my mind, keeping sleep at bay. Eli? James's voice came softly through the darkness, answering my unspoken wish. Are you awake? Yes, I replied, turning toward his voice, though I couldn't see him in the shadows. Can't sleep? No. There was a rustle as he shifted position on the couch. Too many thoughts. The honesty in his voice encouraged my own. Me too, I admitted. I keep thinking about everything. It was vague, but somehow I knew he would understand what I meant. The strangeness of our meeting, the unexpected connection between us, the feelings neither of us had fully named, but both had acknowledged were there. Come sit with me? He asked, the question tentative, giving me every opportunity to refuse. Just to talk, if you want to. I hesitated only briefly before pushing back my blanket and crossing the short distance to the couch. James moved to make room for me, sitting up so I could settle at the other end. Even in the darkness, I was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth emanating from him, the faint scent of my soap on his skin, the careful way he held himself to maintain space between us. When I was sitting in that rain yesterday, he began, his voice low in the darkness, I had reached a kind of end. Not actively planning anything, but I had stopped seeing a way forward. Stopped believing there was any reason to try. The admission sent a chill through me. The confirmation of what I had suspected when I first saw him. The emptiness in his eyes, the surrender in his posture. And then you were there asking if I was all right. Such a simple question, but no one had asked me that in months. No one had really looked at me. I'm glad I did, I said softly. Ask, I mean. I almost didn't. In the city, people don't usually... I trailed off, remembering my hesitation, the internal debate about whether to approach him or continue walking, how close I had come to missing this connection entirely, to passing by the cafe, to never knowing James at all. The thought made my chest tighten with a retroactive fear. Why did you? He asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Approach me, offer dinner, invite me here. It's not common behavior, especially in the city. There was no accusation in the question, just a desire to understand. I thought about it, wanting to give him an honest answer rather than the simplified explanation I'd offered before. In the community, I said slowly, we're taught to see God in everyone, to treat strangers as if they might be angels in disguise, testing our compassion. I smiled slightly at how this must sound to him, superstitious perhaps or naively religious. But that's not really why. I think I recognize something in you, something familiar even though we're from such different worlds. What did you recognize? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I could feel him watching me through the darkness, attentive to every word. Loneliness, I said after a moment. But not just that, a kind of separateness. Like you were seeing a different world than everyone around you, living in a different reality. I hesitated, then continued, the night making honesty easier somehow. That's how I've felt since leaving the community. Present but not part of things. Watching life through a window. And when I saw you sitting there in the rain, I thought, he understands. He knows what this feels like. James was quiet for so long I began to worry I'd said too much, revealed too much of my own isolation. Then I felt his hand find mine in the darkness. A tentative touch, fingers brushing against mine where they rested on the couch between us. You saw correctly, he murmured. That's exactly how it's been. Like I'm a ghost among the living, present but not substantial. His fingers intertwined with mine slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. Instead, I let our hands settle together, his larger one enclosing mine with gentle pressure. The contact sent warmth spreading up my arm, into my chest, a physical sensation that matched the emotional one unfolding inside me. I haven't wanted to feel anything in a long time, James said, his voice low and intimate in the darkness. After Claire, it seemed safer that way. Emptier, but safer. His thumb moved slightly against my hand, a small caress. But since you spoke to me in the rain, Eli, I do. Feel things. Want things. There was a vulnerability in his admission that made my heart ache with tenderness. I haven't wanted to feel this in a long time, but I do now. What do you feel? I asked, the question escaping before I could reconsider its boldness. In the darkness, I heard his breath catch slightly. Alive, he said simply. I feel alive again, and terrified because of it. The honesty in his voice, the raw emotion behind the words, moved something deep within me. Without thinking, I shifted closer to him on the couch, our shoulders touching now as well as our hands. I'm scared too, I admitted. Of all of this, these feelings. Growing up in the community, I'd had no language for the emotions that sometimes flared within me when certain boys smiled my way, when the summer heat required shirts to be removed during barn work, when forbidden thoughts crept into my dreams at night. Just shame, confusion, and silent prayers for strength to overcome what I'd been taught was sinful weakness. I never allowed myself to imagine this possibility. We can go as slowly as you need, James said softly, understanding in his voice, or stop entirely. Whatever you're comfortable with, Eli. I would never want to. No, I interrupted gently. I don't want to stop. I need time to understand what I'm feeling, what it means. I squeezed his hand gently, wanting him to know that despite my fear, despite my uncertainty, I was choosing this, choosing him, choosing us, whatever us might become. We talked through the night, our hands remaining joined as the darkness enveloped us in its protective anonymity. James shared more about his life before, his childhood in a small coastal town, his passion for art that led him to academia, his marriage to Claire that had been loving but not without its complexities. I've always been drawn to both women and men, he admitted quietly. Claire knew, accepted it as part of who I am, but after she died, I shut down completely. Didn't let myself feel attraction to anyone. I listened, absorbing this new understanding of him, this additional layer of his identity. The concept of being drawn to both men and women was foreign to me. In the community, relationships were strictly defined, their purpose, procreation, and family, nothing more. The idea that love and desire could be more fluid, more complex, was both confusing and strangely liberating. How did you know, I asked hesitantly, that you felt that way? James was thoughtful, taking time to consider his answer. It wasn't a single moment of revelation, he said finally. More a gradual awareness, a series of attractions and connections that eventually formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. He paused, his thumb continuing its gentle movement against my hand. The heart recognizes what it wants, even when the mind tries to deny it. At least that was my experience. I thought about my own heart, the way it had responded to James from that first rain-soaked meeting, the pull I'd felt toward him that went beyond compassion or curiosity. Had my heart recognized something my mind was still struggling to accept? The community had taught me that the heart was deceitful above all things, that feelings must be subjected to the strict governance of faith and tradition. But here, in this darkness with James's hand warm in mine, those teachings seemed distant, less compelling than the truth of what I felt. Dawn found us still talking, our voices grown hoarse with hours of conversation. Our bodies shifted gradually closer until we sat side by side, shoulders and legs touching, hands still intertwined. The growing light revealed James's face, tired but somehow younger, as if the night of sharing had lifted some weight from him. His eyes, when they met mine, held a warmth that made my chest tighten with a mix of joy and fear. This was real, what was happening between us. Real and terrifying and beautiful. I should make coffee, I said, reluctant to break the spell of the night but aware of the day beginning outside our window. James nodded, equally reluctant, his hand lingering in mine for a moment before releasing it. The loss of contact left me feeling strangely bereft, as if some essential connection had been severed. The next few days developed a rhythm, a tentative dance of growing closeness and careful boundaries. James continued to sleep on the couch, but our days were spent together, exploring the city, James showing me parts of it I hadn't discovered on my own, me introducing him to the small treasures I'd found in my wanderings. The bookstore where I worked became a favorite haunt, Elaine watching with barely concealed interest as James browsed the shelves while waiting for my shift to end. "Friend of yours?" she asked one afternoon, eyebrows raised as she followed my gaze to where James stood examining a volume of poetry. "Yes," I said simply, the word inadequate for what he was becoming to me. yet the only one I had that felt safe to share. Elaine nodded, something knowing in her expression that made me wonder what she saw when she looked at us together. "He looks better than he did last week," she observed, surprising me. At my questioning look, she smiled slightly. "He used to come in sometimes before you started working here. Would sit in the history section for hours, never buying anything. Looked like a man at the end of his rope." She glanced at James again, her expression softening. "Whatever you're doing, it seems to be helping." Her words stayed with me, the confirmation that James had indeed been as lost as he'd appeared when I found him in the rain. It filled me with a fierce protectiveness, a determination to help him find his way back to himself, even as I was still finding my own path. In quiet moments together, I began to see glimpses of the man he must have been before grief hollowed him out. Intelligent, passionate about art and history, possessed of a dry humor that emerged like sun through clouds when he felt secure. We were careful with each other, mindful of the fragility of what was growing between us. Physical contact remained limited to small touches, hands brushing as we passed items between us, shoulders touching as we walked side by side, knees occasionally meeting under my small table as we ate meals together. Each point of contact sent awareness through me, a current of something more than friendship that neither of us named explicitly but both acknowledged in glances, in the way conversation sometimes trailed into charged silence, in the careful distance we maintained even as we drew closer emotionally. A week after that rainy evening, James received a call from the university where he'd once taught. A former colleague had been trying to reach him for months, had finally tracked down his cell phone number. They needed someone to fill in for a professor on sudden medical leave, a short-term position teaching 2 introductory art history courses. "They remembered me," James said, wonder in his voice as he told me about the call. "After everything, they still thought of me." "Of course they did," I replied, happiness for him mixing with a selfish fear that this might change things between us, might pull him away from the careful world we'd been building. "You were good at it, teaching. You said so yourself." "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted, vulnerability in his eyes as they met mine. "Step back into that life, even partially, face students, colleagues, my old self." The fear in his voice was palpable, and without thinking, I reached for his hand across the table, a gesture that had become more natural between us since that night of conversation in darkness. "You can," I said firmly, meaning it. "And you don't have to be your old self. You can be who you are now." I squeezed his hand gently. "I'll help however I can." The gratitude in his expression made something expand in my chest, a warmth that spread outward, encompassing everything. He took the position. 2 classes, 3 days a week. The salary was modest but represented a stability neither of us had expected. "I'll get my own place," he said on the day he received the official offer, the 2 of us sitting on a park bench, watching pigeons scatter and regroup in endless patterns. "Something small, near campus." The word sent a chill through me. The thought of him leaving, of our daily closeness ending, even though I knew it was the logical next step. I'd never intended for him to stay on my couch indefinitely, yet the prospect of his departure left me feeling hollow. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "That makes sense." I stared at the pigeons, avoiding his eyes, afraid he might read the selfish disappointment in mine. To my surprise, I felt his hand cover mine where it rested on the bench between us. A bold gesture for us, here in public, in daylight. "Eli," he said softly, waiting until I looked at him before continuing. "I'm not disappearing. This thing between us, whatever it is," he paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It matters to me. You matter to me. More than I can properly express." "To me too," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "You matter to me too." It wasn't everything I felt, everything I wanted to say, but it was a truth I could offer without fear. James's smile in response was like sunrise, gradual, warming, illuminating. That evening, as we walked back to my apartment under a sky streaked with sunset colors, James stopped suddenly, turning to face me on the nearly empty sidewalk. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, a seriousness in his expression that made my heart rate quicken with apprehension. "And I want you to answer honestly, without concern for my feelings." "All right," I said cautiously, uncertain what was coming. James took a deep breath, his eyes steady on mine. "Am I good for you, Eli?" he asked, the question taking me by surprise. This connection between us, is it helping you find your way in this new life, or is it complicating things, making it harder for you to discover who you are apart from your community? There was genuine concern in his voice, a selflessness that moved me deeply. You're just beginning to explore who you are, what you want. I don't want to impose my presence, my needs, my history onto that journey. The question deserved careful consideration, and I gave it that, thinking about the weeks since I'd left the community, the loneliness that had threatened to overwhelm me, the sense of drifting without anchor or compass. And then James, the unexpected connection, the feeling of being truly seen for perhaps the first time in my life, the way his presence had given shape and meaning to days that had previously blurred together in an anxious haze of survival. Yes, I said finally, certainty growing within me as I spoke. You are good for me. Before I met you, I was existing, just getting through each day, no direction, no real connection to anyone or anything. I met his gaze steadily, wanting him to see the truth in my eyes. You haven't made anything harder, James. You've made it possible for me to breathe, to think, to feel something besides fear and loneliness. I hesitated, then added, whatever this is between us, it's helping me understand myself better, not obscuring it. Relief softened his features, a tension I hadn't fully registered now visibly easing from his shoulders. Thank you, he said simply, for considering the question seriously, for your honesty. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that had become familiar, yet never lost its power to send warmth through my entire body. We continued walking hand in hand now, a new openness in this public acknowledgement of our connection. That night, our last before James would begin his teaching position, we sat on my small balcony overlooking the city lights, sharing the bottle of wine he'd bought to celebrate his return to work. The night was warm, summer firmly established now, so different from the rain-soaked evening when we'd met. I watched James as he gazed out at the skyline, his profile outlined against the darkness, and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly took my breath away. Pride in his courage, joy in his second chance, and something deeper that I was finally allowing myself to name, if only in the privacy of my own thoughts. "What are you thinking?" he asked, turning to find me watching him, a smile touching his lips at whatever he saw in my expression. "That I'm glad I spoke to you that night," I said honestly. "That I can't imagine these past days without you in them." The wine had loosened my tongue slightly, made candor easier. "That I'm proud of you for tomorrow, for trying again?" James's expression softened, his eyes reflecting the city lights as they held mine. "I wouldn't be doing it without you," he said quietly. "You pulled me back from a very dark edge, Eli. Reminded me there were still things worth feeling, worth fighting for." He set his wine glass down on the small table between us, his movements deliberate. "May I?" he began, then hesitated, unusual uncertainty in his voice. "May I hold you? Just that, nothing more. I just want—" I nodded before he could finish, my heart accelerating as he rose from his chair and came to where I sat, kneeling before me so our eyes were level. Slowly, giving me every chance to withdraw, he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around me, drawing me into an embrace that was gentle yet secure, tentative yet certain. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to lean into his warmth, my own arms coming up to encircle him in return. We stayed that way for what felt like both an eternity and not nearly long enough. His heartbeat steady against mine, his breath warm against my neck. There was nothing sexual in the embrace, yet it felt more intimate than anything I'd ever experienced. A connection that went beyond physical, that encompassed mind and heart and soul. When we finally drew apart just far enough to see each other's faces, something had shifted between us. A threshold crossed, a decision made without words. James's hand rose to my face, his fingers gentle as they traced the line of my cheek, the curve of my jaw. The touch was feather light, yet I felt it everywhere, a current running through my entire body. "Eli," he whispered, my name in his mouth a kind of prayer. His eyes asked a question his lips didn't form, and I answered by leaning forward slightly, reducing the distance between us. His lips met mine with exquisite gentleness, barely a touch at first, giving me every opportunity to pull away. Instead, I moved closer, one hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat accelerate beneath my palm. The kiss deepened slightly, remained tender, a conversation without words about care and consent and mutual desire. When we parted, his forehead rested against mine, our breathing synchronized in the quiet night air. Is this okay? He asked softly, his hand still cradling my face.